a place where honor should speak louder than skin color, a former officer made a mistake he would never forget. Beneath the gilded arches of a centuries-old hall, among lords, generals, and dignitaries dressed in their finest regalia, he singled out one man, a black royal guard, standing tall and proud in full ceremonial uniform, and ordered him to leave. The room, heavy with tradition and unspoken hierarchy, turned cold in an instant. A sea of witnesses, trained to revere order, watched as a moment of raw injustice unfolded before their eyes. Yet it wasn't the officer's cruelty that the world would remember. It was the guard's calm, unshakable response that would leave the room silent, and history forever changed. Before we reveal how a single moment turned into history, how one act of quiet courage would echo far beyond the gilded walls of that ancient hall, tell us in the comments, where in the world are you watching from? And stay with us, because this is a story about dignity rising against prejudice, and how true strength often speaks in the calmest voice. Corporal Daniel Carter had never needed to be told what it meant to earn respect. He had been raised to understand it. The son of a decorated military veteran, he grew up in the quiet streets of Nottingham, where duty was spoken about like scripture and hard work was the measure of a man's worth. His father, a man of few words and steady hands, taught him early that true strength wasn't in the voice that shouted the loudest, but in the one that stood its ground without needing to. At 17, Daniel followed in his father's footsteps, enlisting with a heart full of hope and a stubborn belief that honor still mattered. The uniform came with weight, the weight of history, of expectation, and for him, the silent, added burden that came with the color of his skin. He learned quickly that while the Royal Guard prized discipline and loyalty above all, not every pair of eyes that met his did so without judgment. Yet, through 8 long years of service, through punishing drills, sleepless nights guarding palaces, and ceremonies watched by millions, Daniel wore his uniform like a second skin, not to prove he belonged, but because he already knew he did. Quietly, steadily, he rose through the ranks. His record was impeccable, his conduct beyond reproach. And now, on this day, he stood newly promoted, bearing the silver braid of honor on his shoulder for the first time at a royal ceremony. It should have been a day of celebration, a hard-earned step toward the future he had built one silent sacrifice at a time. Instead, it would become something else entirely, a test he hadn't chosen, a confrontation he had spent a lifetime preparing for without knowing it. As the ancient clock in the hall chimed the hour, and the great doors swung open to admit the procession of royalty and history, Daniel Carter adjusted his stance, squared his shoulders, and reminded himself no one could strip him of what he had already earned. Not today, not ever. The royal hall had stood for over 4 centuries, a monument to power, tradition, and the quiet gravity of a nation that measured its changes in centuries, not seasons. That morning, as sunlight poured through its towering stained glass windows, the ancient stone walls seemed almost alive with memory. The air was thick with the scent of polished oak and fresh-cut flowers, the marble floors gleaming like still water beneath the weight of 1,000 footsteps. Rows of gilded chairs lined the great nave, occupied by men and women who wore their histories on their chests, medals, sashes, and ceremonial regalia gleaming in the morning light. The world had gathered here today, not merely to witness, but to affirm the old promises of loyalty, of honor, of silent service. Every corner of the hall pulsed with quiet grandeur. The banners of forgotten battles hung motionless in the high vaults above, their colors muted by time, but their meaning undiminished. The royal guards stood shoulder to shoulder, a living wall of tradition. Their uniforms, crimson and navy with gold trim, caught the light in crisp angles, each movement, each breath measured and silent. Alongside them, at the head of the formation, stood Corporal Daniel Carter. His posture was perfect, his boots shining like mirrors against the marble, the silver braid of his recent promotion catching the sun in a soft shimmer. He was not just another figure among the rows, he was a symbol, whether the others recognized it or not. A quiet declaration that honor did not belong to bloodlines, nor faces carved from the same old stone, but to anyone who dared to carry it without apology. His presence did not rewrite history, but it whispered of a future where dignity was not defined by color, but by character. As the great bronze doors creaked open, and the procession of nobles and officials entered, gowns sweeping the floor, medals clinking faintly with every step, Daniel inhaled deeply. He let the ancient weight of the place settle onto his shoulders. He did not flinch beneath it. He bore it the way he bore everything else, with a quiet, unshakable pride that needed no permission and asked for no forgiveness. But not every eye in the room looked upon him with welcome, and soon one voice would rise above the whispered ceremonies, not to honor him, but to try and strip him of the very thing he had spent a lifetime building. The hall was so still that every footstep seemed to echo into forever. The procession moved slowly toward the dais where the ceremony would soon begin, the gathered dignitaries exchanging soft murmurs, the rustle of gowns and the glint of polished shoes weaving a muted tapestry of tradition. Corporal Daniel Carter held his position near the entrance, posture flawless, eyes forward, his very presence a study in silent pride. It happened with no warning. A sudden, sharp voice cut through the solemn atmosphere, like a blade through silk. "You there!" the voice barked, rough with the arrogance of authority long past its prime. Heads turned, conversations faltered. The man stepping forward wore the insignia of a retired officer, his medals gleaming against his dark blazer, his bearing stiff with self-importance. His face was flushed, his mouth curled into a sneer as he fixed his gaze on Daniel. "You don't belong here," the former officer said, loud enough that even those at the far end of the hall turned to look. The words hung in the air, heavy, obscene against the backdrop of tradition and ceremony. A ripple of shock moved through the gathering like a current beneath calm waters. Some gasped quietly, others froze, their expressions torn between disbelief and dread. The officer advanced a step closer, his finger jabbing at Daniel's chest, stopping just short of contact. "This is a place for those who have earned the right," he spat. "Not for displays, not for appearances." Around them, the grand hall seemed to shrink, the magnificence of the setting paling against the raw ugliness of the moment. The royal guards along the walls shifted almost imperceptibly, their discipline holding them in place, even as the tension twisted the air around them, tight as a drum. Daniel did not move. He did not flinch. He let the words pass over him like a wave against stone. When he finally spoke, his voice was low but steady, every syllable measured, carrying not the bite of anger but the weight of something far stronger. Truth. "I stand here," Daniel said, "not because of how I look. I stand here because of what I have given, what I have earned, and what I will protect with every breath I draw." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the high-ranking officials, men and women who had spent their lives behind walls of power and privilege, could not find words. Only the distant echo of the great hall's ancient clock, marking the passing of a single eternal second, broke the stillness. The former officer's mouth opened as if to retort, but no sound came. His authority, so carefully cultivated, and once so absolute, crumbled in the face of a man who needed no medals to affirm his place. Daniel remained still, his pike grounded firmly at his side, his head high, his uniform gleaming under the shafts of morning light. He did not need to shout. He did not need to defend himself with anger. His very presence, calm, unyielding, unbreakable, was his answer. Slowly, one by one, eyes began to turn away from the former officer, the man's bluster collapsing under the unbearable gravity of the moment. The officials turned back to their seats. The nobles averted their gazes. Whispers fluttered through the hall, not against Daniel, but in quiet, horrified astonishment at what they had just witnessed. No one spoke to the former officer again. No one applauded Daniel either. But in the heavy, sacred silence that filled the hall, something shifted. Respect, true respect, earned and undeniable, rose to take its place where old prejudice had tried and failed to remain. The ceremony proceeded, but the real moment, the one no history book would record, but every soul in the room would remember, had already passed. And it belonged to Corporal Daniel Carter. The ceremony moved forward as if nothing had happened, but the air inside the hall had changed. It was heavier now, weighted with something unspoken. Every step of the procession, every solemn chant, seemed to carry the faint tremor of the confrontation, still echoing through the marble and stone. Corporal Daniel Carter held his position until the final anthem faded, his stance unflinching, his breathing measured and slow. Only when the last of the dignitaries had been seated and the eyes of the assembly turned elsewhere did two fellow guards approach him, wordless, precise, respectful. A soft gesture to the side was all it took. Daniel understood. He stepped back from the line, his boots clicking softly against the polished floor, the sound barely rising above the hush that had settled over the grand hall. He walked with them through the narrow service corridors, away from the ceremony, away from the reverent prayers still drifting in the air. The hallways grew darker, colder, the ceremonial grandeur stripped away until only stone and silence remained. Behind them, the whispers began, soft at first, then gathering like a rising tide. Some clutched their pearls tighter, others exchanged sharp, hurried glances, and somewhere, among the velveted dignity, anger stirred. Not against Daniel, but against the rupture he had revealed. Inside a small, plain chamber near the guards' offices, Daniel waited. The door closed behind him with a soft, definitive thud, sealing him in with his own thoughts. He stood at attention, his helmet tucked beneath his arm, his heart pounding against his ribs. Was this how it ended? 8 years of silent devotion, erased by a single moment of defiance. A lifetime of discipline, measured by the narrow gaze of men who had never known what it meant to stand both for a flag and against a prejudice stitched deep into its fabric. The questions gnawed at him, sharp and cruel. Should he have lowered his eyes? Should he have endured the insult and let the tide of ceremony wash over the ugliness, smoothing it away until it disappeared from memory? Survival, after all, had its own kind of dignity. But as he stared at the blank stone wall in front of him, Daniel knew the answer was already written into his bones. He had not raised his voice. He had not struck back. He had stood. He had spoken, calmly, firmly, without shame. And no punishment, no reprimand, no dismissal could touch the truth of that. Still, the uncertainty wrapped around him like a second uniform, heavier than armor. He had seen enough to know that justice and appearances did not always walk hand in hand. It would have been so easy for them to silence him with a quiet discharge, to erase the memory of the moment from the polished histories they so carefully guarded. Minutes passed, slow and grinding, each one stretching into the next like an endless march. In the silence, Daniel braced himself, not against fear, but against the cold inevitability that sometimes, even when you did everything right, the world found ways to make you pay for being seen. And yet, even as he prepared himself for the worst, a strange peace settled over him. He had done what he was meant to do. He had honored not just the uniform he wore, but the man who wore it. Whatever came next, he would meet it standing tall. Because real honor wasn't handed to you in medals. It wasn't sewn into a uniform. It lived, or it didn't, inside you. And today, Daniel Carter had made sure that it lived. Elsewhere in the labyrinth of stone corridors and hushed offices that formed the hidden heart of the palace, a different conversation was unfolding. One Daniel Carter could not have heard, even if he had strained his ears against the thick oak doors. Among the guests gathered that day had been more than dukes and diplomats. Seated discreetly in a row reserved for senior palace officials was the Queen's private secretary, a man who had long served as the unseen architect of royal order, the bridge between the old ways and whatever future dared to knock at the palace gates. And he had seen everything. From his place among the polished ranks, he had watched as the former officer's voice had risen, as the room's ancient air had turned brittle with the weight of old hatred. He had watched as Daniel Carter stood, not with anger, not with defiance, but with the kind of dignity that could not be taught, could not be bought, and could not be erased by prejudice. And in that stillness, the private secretary understood something that too many others had forgotten, that real loyalty was not obedience to the past, but courage in the present. The following morning, before the first light had breached the city's stone walls, a private letter was dispatched from the royal household. It was addressed to the commander of the royal guards and signed with the unmistakable seal of the Queen herself. Its language was formal, but beneath the elegance of the words, the message was clear. The Crown wishes it to be known that Corporal Daniel Carter's conduct at the ceremony yesterday reflects the highest standards of honor, dignity, and service expected of a royal guard. His restraint and composure in the face of provocation shall serve as an example to all who wear the uniform. No action is to be taken against him. Instead, a note of commendation is to be entered into his official record. At the same time, another directive moved quietly through the upper corridors of power. The former officer, whose outburst had drawn the eyes of the world and the silent judgment of history, was summoned privately. There were no cameras, no headlines, only a closed door, a senior official, and a document that left no room for argument. A formal reprimand was issued, a rare public mark against a man who had once believed himself untouchable. And though no announcement would be shouted from the palace balconies, word spread through the ranks like wildfire. An apology was being prepared, one that would be read in a private ceremony before the guard itself, acknowledging not just a breach of decorum, but a betrayal of the very values the Crown claimed to uphold. The palace would not allow the stain of that moment to linger on Daniel Carter. Instead, it would be turned, quietly but unmistakably, into a testament to what true service, true strength, truly meant. The sun hung low over the royal grounds as the quiet ceremony unfolded behind closed doors, far from the curious eyes of the world. There were no grand speeches, no parades, no television cameras jostling for the perfect angle. Only the steady, solemn gathering of the royal guard and a handful of senior officials who understood the weight of the moment far better than words could express. Corporal Daniel Carter stood at the center of the stone-floored hall where countless generations had once pledged their loyalty. His uniform was flawless, his posture unshakable, the silver braid on his shoulder gleaming as the light slanted through the high windows. The commander of the guard, a man known more for his silence than ceremony, stepped forward and, with quiet gravity, pinned a small medal to Daniel's chest. For exemplary conduct under public scrutiny, the citation read, a few simple words that carried the full weight of what had been endured and what had been overcome. No applause followed, no need. The silence itself was the highest honor that could be given, a silence rich with respect, thick with unspoken acknowledgment that something larger than protocol had been defended that day. Later, when the hall had emptied and the world outside moved on without noticing, a new plaque was installed quietly along the ancient stone walls of the Royal Guard's private wing. It bore no dates, no long explanations, just a single line carved deep into the polished wood beneath the shields and names of heroes. True strength is silent, but never invisible. And beneath that, without ceremony, the name Corporal Daniel Carter was etched, small, almost modest, but unmovable. Standing alone before it, helmet tucked beneath his arm, Daniel allowed himself a single, slow breath. He hadn't sought recognition. He hadn't demanded justice. He had simply stood, where others might have faltered, where silence could have been a surrender. And because of that, something within these ancient halls had shifted, ever so slightly, toward the world he had always believed it could be. He turned sharply on his heel, the sound of his boots echoing through the vaulted space. And as he stepped back into formation with the others, the line closed around him, not in tolerance, but in silent, unspoken brotherhood. Sometimes the loudest victories are the ones won in silence. Sometimes dignity speaks louder than anger ever could, carving a deeper, more lasting mark on the hearts of those who witness it. In a world quick to reward the loudest voices and the fiercest tempers, there is still power, unshakable, undeniable, in the man who stands quietly, refusing to bow to anything but truth. Corporal Daniel Carter didn't need to shout to be heard. He didn't need to fight to win. He stood calm and unwavering, and in doing so changed more than just a single room. He changed what that room would remember about strength. Have you ever faced injustice with quiet strength? Have you ever chosen to hold your ground when walking away or shouting back might have been easier? Tell us your story in the comments below, and if this journey moved you, stay with us for more powerful stories where honor outshines prejudice and dignity lights the path forward.